biggest change in me since I've taken the Dale Carnegie course is my ability to project, to be honest, to project and to actually speak up in meetings, speak up in crowds, speak up. My name is Serenia Granville, and I'm a graduate of the Dale Carnegie School. My inner voice comes from a younger me, an 8-year-old girl who was constantly told that she would not amount to much. In meetings for my professional life, my career life, I knew I didn't communicate with my audience well. I had to reach down inside of myself and say, Serenia, it's time to develop your speaking skills, your presentation skills. My aha moment in the course was when I learned that everyone that goes up to speak is nervous, right? But the difference is that they actually endure their nervousness. That was my breakthrough moment, knowing that others experience this same nervousness. You have this one life to live. One life. Make the best of this life. Make the best of it.
If you look at it and you say, am I the type of person that wants to improve? Am I the type of person that wants to learn? Am I the type of person that wants to move forward in life? Then this is a great course. So my name is Glenn Calakira. I'm very introspective, so I look at myself as, what more could I do to be a better person? What more can I do to be more effective in my job? How can I advance in my career? How can I be more successful? So if I can find tools, methods, programs, things to help me, then that's what I should do. At my company, there's a lot of moving parts, but a lot of times the stronger personality wins in the room. And I think what Dale Carnegie's course taught me is everybody's opinion matters. You too could have strength to be able to convey your opinion in an effective, clear way. And that technique gave me a lot of confidence. It's important to be honest. It's important to be genuine. It's important to be trustworthy. There were a few incidents in the class where people had shared really personal stories about their life and what they've been through because there was a relevance to the topic. But what they were really doing was getting out of their shell, and that's part of the program, right? It might not just be a course, for people. It could be a changing event in their life.
Hello, my name is David Urban. I am Dean of the Jennings A. Jones College of Business at Middle Tennessee State University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second event in an ongoing series of lifelong learning seminars dealing with current and emerging topics in business today. Today's presenter is Allyn Walker. Allyn is the managing partner of Dale Carnegie, Tennessee and Georgia. He has led the team since 2001, resulting in multiple years of revenue and profit growth. Allyn is a facilitator and a coach with a driven focus on others' success. His strength is seeing how to implement talent development strategies within organizations, resulting in cultural transformation. His organization has been recognized as top 5 in global revenue, top growth and top 10 in market penetration, top cumulative annual growth rate, and top quality in North America based on Net Promoter Scores. Allyn has also received the highest honor for Dale Carnegie franchisees, the One Dale Carnegie Award, recognizing his contributions to the greater Dale Carnegie global network. In addition, his organization has been a finalist multiple times for the Better Business Bureau's Torch Awards for Ethical Commerce. I've had the pleasure of working in partnership with Allyn on the Jones College Dale Carnegie Initiative, which began in 2014. Since 2015, all undergraduate business majors in Jones College have been required to complete the Dale Carnegie course in Human Relations and Communication. To our knowledge, Jones College is the only collegiate business school in the country that requires students to take this course as a way to improve their soft skills. As of the end of the 2021 fall semester, over 4,500 students have taken the course, and the effect on their self-confidence, communication abilities, human relations skills, leadership development, and attitude formation have been nothing short of transformational. Today's presentation is titled Creativity is Social, and it's based on data from the Dale Carnegie Global Research Team. They survey global businesses for trends and issues that impact employees and organizations. Today's presentation combines reports from their research with gathered data from industry experts. Let's welcome Allyn Walker.
Thank you, Dr. Urban. So in 1962, Professor George Lund did an experiment with some kindergartners where he took some NASA-defined research and tried to estimate their creativity. And so he took those 5 to 6-year-olds in 1962 and was able to determine that 98% of them scored high on the creativity exam that had been put together. Now, that longitudinal study tracked those same students over 10 years, and when they were age 15, he discovered that on that same study, they only scored at 12%. That same study was then done on adults in the United States, several 100,000, and they topped out at 2% on the study. Which leads us to wonder, it's not that we aren't creative as individuals, but something happens in that interpersonal dynamic space that creates a challenge for us as it comes to creativity. And that's not just for us in terms of high schoolers and as adults, but in organizations as well. And so that was the question we wanted to answer. What are the dynamics that happen within organizations that either build creativity and allow innovation to occur or suppress it? That's what we're going to have an opportunity to spend the next hour exploring today. So in terms of a quick agenda, you'll see that we will take a look at that. What is the business case for creativity? I suppose we ought to start there. Is it something we're interested in to begin with? Because we won't support it if not. And then take a look at what are some of the paradoxes of creativity? What are some things that we battle against when we think about what creativity means in our space? We'll take a look at some of those interpersonal aspects that we've defined and then discuss ways as organizations, how do we foster creativity and innovation in our space? It's interesting that as we've been going through this pandemic, that when we take a look at creativity, it's a precursor for innovation. So we define creativity, as you see, as the generation of novel and useful ideas, often by connecting knowledge in new ways, taking what we have and putting it together in a way that creates something new. In organizations, we also drive innovation, which is taking those very ideas and realizing them in a way that's productive for the organization that, at that last phrase there, creates value. So we have the creative spark, but then the innovation that drives it to something useful and creating value in the organization. And what we find that with the crisis of COVID, there's really opportunities and challenges along this space. There was a survey that was done by McKinsey that said that 90% of executives believe that COVID-19 is going to create opportunities for significant innovation and growth. Those same executives, only 21% of them felt like they were able to realize what that might be. In other words, opportunities are there, but how do we realize those opportunities for our organizations? And when we look at it, are we prepared? Because organizations maintain that both those things are important over the next 3 to 5 years. So the question then becomes for us to consider: is creativity necessary for us in our organizations today? And what benefits might we derive if we had more creative, innovative organization and teams? And so I'm going to ask this question. As we go through the process today, the workshop today, we're going to do a couple of things. And part of it will be some opportunity for insight and interactivity. There's several of you that are joining us online, and we have a chat, I believe, that'll be running with ideas. And so I'll be asking questions, and you'll have the opportunity to add your voice to the conversation by jotting some things down in the chat. In addition, we have some folks here live in person who will be discussing some of those items as well. And so when we think about a group discussion, what are some of the areas where creativity and innovation could help our organizations? What might be some of those benefits? So start considering in your organization or team, what are areas where creativity and innovation could truly help and drive continued value? Again, you can put that into the chat, and we're going to discuss that in just a moment. In terms of creativity being good for business, let me give you some suggestions or some ideas. First of all, creativity innovation could be applied towards satisfaction of customers. It was mentioned our Net Promoter Score, the likelihood of people promoting your organization, and client experience has become key to drive client loyalty. So how innovative or creative are we in terms of that client experience? Productivity is one that when we think about if we're going to be working from anywhere or hybrid or in person, how we innovate, how we work is going to be critical moving forward for our organization. And that'll define our employee productivity. Perhaps it's innovation in terms of services or products or how we go to market, taking a look at how we capture space, either disruptively or innovatively ahead. It could be that, again, that customer experience that I identified, and how is the results from a financial perspective? So I've given you some ideas of where that could impact. Where is creativity and innovation going to be important for our organizations? And so we'll have an opportunity now to ask the group in the room and the chat as well, what would be some spaces where you see creativity and innovation being important? Who would have an idea to share? I think we have some in the chat already. Darby?
Jean Lacey Wilson said, increase student enrollment and increase student engagement.
So it's not just that they're here, but they're engaged in the organization as well, which I would think applied to any organization. How do we increase our employee engagement, which then is going to directly impact our employee productivity as well? Thank you. Who would have another? Yes.
How about how creativity could help us in the planning stages?
And tell me more about that, Kenneth.
Well, as we look in any organization, how we are going to move forward, then having the opportunity to create create is the right word, create an environment where people can come forward with their ideas to help us realize the opportunities that might be out there for us.
To generate those plannings, those opportunities, and as we know with all plans, any business plan, as soon as it hits the press, is one where it's going to be difficult. There's changes in the marketplace. So, the flexibility, it's that Google Map aspect that I really like, where it says, we found a faster route. Do you accept? I always accept the faster. I'm just kind of that kind of guy. But, is there another way to make this happen versus the way that we identified that it could be?
Kind of in this arena, what happens if you have folks that are creative and innovative, but as you move up the upper management chain, those folks are not? How do we address that to keep my people motivated?
Now we're giving. Oh, that is such a great segue into the next 50 minutes of activities that we'll be walking through for sure. Because I do think that's exactly what we want to focus on, is when you have that creativity within your organization, how do you harness it in a way to create the value that we're focusing on? Do we have one more? Yes.
Yeah, sure. I think that connection to alumni of MTSU is very important, and there are some universities that do it really well, and that is a space where creativity could really pay off. And not a lot of people stay on campus; they don't have that similar campus experience. But to stay connected to alumni, we do need to inject more creativity.
When you think of the aspects of generational preferences, modalities, the different technology that's at play, I believe that would translate not just for universities, but for organizations that are wanting to keep their customers close. For organizations, there was an article recently in the Harvard Business Review that talked about the alumni of people. That we've been going through this great resignation. You have people that might be transitioning out of your organization. How do you do that in a way that they stay alumni of your firm and can continue to bring value and maybe even boomerang down the road as well? So all those things become critical aspects. So the first question we have to ask ourselves as business leaders is, do I believe that creativity and innovation is the route forward? Because if so, we have some great ideas. If not, then you're probably not in the seminar anyway. So I'm just going to assume that most people are on the bandwagon of creativity is going to be important to their organization. So Dale Carnegie in 2021 did a creativity study. And so we took a look at organizations that were around 21 countries and territories in a variety of industries and company sizes. And so to take a look at that research and identify highly creative organizations and what do they do to drive that. And so we're going to reveal some of that research as we go through and think about creativity today in our spaces. One organization that's well known for creativity, in fact, they wrote the book Creativity Inc., if you've had a chance to read that over the last decade, was Disney and Pixar. And in fact, the CEO of Pixar said that after the success of Toy Story, Catmull, he said that his main priority was to ensure the continued creativity of the organization. So it wasn't just the continued success, the continued next Toy Story, the next whatever it might have been in terms of a movie, but he felt his job was to nurture and to develop the creativity in the organization. There was another book that was written called Humankind by Bregman, who talks about just that, creativity, and are we creative or not? And through anthropological research, the answer, of course, as we noted with the kindergartners, is yes. So the creativity is there. The creativity drives results in our organizations. And based on the research that was done by our organization, many people do believe that we are inherently creative. I love this stat. 82% of respondents said there are creative people on their team. I thought it was interesting the way the question was, not are you creative, because I don't think we would have hit 82%, but are there creative people? So it's something we recognize in each other that sometimes we don't recognize in ourselves in terms of our own inherent creativity that we have. And so I think we have an obligation then as leaders, not just to understand that people are creative, but then to nurture and to ensure that they see the creativity that they have in the organization as well. It does create some paradoxes in terms of creativity, mindsets that we're going to have to think through as we think about creativity. First of all, is creativity an individual or is it a social process? You've probably seen the book called The Founder's Myth. We love in Western culture our Greek heroes, this hero myth, the individual who came up with the idea, who solved the problem, the person who created this entrepreneurial organization that made all the difference in the world. And basically what the research shows is that is a myth. Pick almost any example you can, and what you find is that it wasn't an individual, it was a social process that drove that type of result for the organization, and yet often we feel like we have to go into a box and be creative. In addition to that, there is a conflict between cooperation and conflict in reference to creativity. Is creativity something we do together, Or is it something that we have to battle each other out, and organizational cultures might have a different flavor to this? Is it something where we sit down and write a song together and it's beautiful, or do we get into a boardroom and we hash it out? Strong ties versus weak ties. This is a research done by Harvard Business Review around the ties we have in the organization. This has really come to light within the COVID crisis. So strong ties are people that we have a strong network with. We know them, we connect with them. You understand the context of their email when they send it to us. We have a strong tie with that individual. Most organizations, you have strong ties and then you have weak ties. Weak ties are basically individuals that you're acquainted with in the organization. You would recognize them walking down the hall. You see them on the Zoom call and you know who they are, but you don't really know them. And so where does creativity come from? Some people would say, well, it's the weak ties because you need a diverse group of individuals in order to generate unique ideas. Others would say, no, strong ties because then we could really understand where each other is going and flow and get into the zone, if you will. The final paradox is diversity versus, sometimes for me, saying words, this is a difficult word, so homogeneous environments. We'll go there. So diversity versus homogeneous environments. On one hand, you'd say diversity is important, and I think we'll show later on that it is. And on the other hand, you say, well, if the ideas are too far afield, we can't get anything that's usable or of value. And so these paradoxes create friction or tension within the creative process in the organization. Is it something that we should do on our own or together? Is it something that we should do together, or should we fight to get the better, kind of the best person wins at the top of the mountain? Is it something where we need a wide scope of ideas or a few people in the skull session to make it happen? Or is it something where weak ties and strong ties make a difference? So my question for you in the chat and in the room as well would be, in terms of those paradoxes, where do you find the friction or the tension? Where do you find it the most difficult question to answer in reference from an organizational perspective? And I think we do have some ideas that have come up in the chat thus far. So, Darby, would you?
Judy asks, does psychological safety foster creativity?
Absolutely. And Judy, if you hang with me for about another 15 minutes, we're going to hit that directly as we go into how to solve some of these paradoxes, for sure, yes.
Tempering the dominant voice in the room, whether it's the individual or social process, that you don't have one person or a couple of folks that are the loudest, that may bang the table the hardest, and they may be drowning out some of the other folks to make sure you are including those. I see the conflict in thinking, disagreement a lot of times lead to a lot of better ideas just as you try to figure out a compromise and things, but going through all of those paradoxes and including them all, just you got to watch that loudest voice that may not always be right.
But they are loud.
They are loud.
Often wrong, but never in doubt, is the way we might say that. And I believe the one aspect that makes that even more challenging for us today is the hybrid work environment. That they've been able to show that people who are physically in the room together have more sway on decisions than people who might be joining remotely into those conversations. And so if you double that dynamic of a very loud voice in the room, and that voice is in the room and drowning out not just those in the room, but those that are outside, kind of weak-tied in that environment, it doubles down on that particular aspect of it. Now just one voice is being heard, not the entirety of the organization.
I think some of it also depends upon the industry in which one finds his or her organization. And I think about my industry, if you will, higher education, that tends to attract people who are very, very independent. They are individually productive. They are self-starters, and a lot of times it is the primacy of the individual that is all important, and so it creates a difficulty in trying to generate some of that social process. Individually, these people are very creative, how much more creative could they be if they interacted socially on those creative pursuits?
It's the question that has to be answered, which is individually, I have a certain horsepower in terms of creativity. What does that look like when it multiplies? And you get several people involved in that process with it. There's a saying that we use a lot in our training where we say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's kind of the paradox that we're dealing with. We can go fast alone, and some of us are attuned to it in our industry, and often that's not sustainable. So if we want to go far, we go together. Darby, we have a comment from in the chat.
We have two, actually. Jim asks, have organizations used improvisation techniques to help break down this conflict?
Some of us have had opportunities to do those type of interplays and those interactions. One of the things about improv is it's an and culture versus a but culture. And so yes, and you're always adding to what's being given versus taking it away. When we do creativity workshops with our clients, we use some improvisational activities to help that mindset from one of critic, like I'm going to criticize the idea, to one of I'm going to cooperate, I'm going to extend the idea that's coming across. And those aspects change depending on what part of the process that we're in, which we'll get to in just a second. But that yes and mentality can be very powerful for psychological safety, which Judy brought up before, and extending out the individual contribution into a social contribution that makes it even better than what it is. It's fun to go through those exercises where you see how ideas morph in beautiful ways when we're utilizing some of those concepts from improv. And you said the other comment?
Jean commented, when we try to do the same thing because it worked in the past, but the environment has changed, it doesn't mean it will still work the same today.
Was that old saying is doing the same thing in the same way and expecting the same result, I would say, is that, we used to say expecting a different result, but doing the same thing in the same way and expecting the same result might be the new definition of insanity with how the market is shifting and changing on us as we move through it. It's always a different dynamic. It's that old story about Einstein where he gives the physics tests in the 50s or 60s or whenever it was, and it was the same questions, the same test, and the students say, this was the same test that you gave last year, and he said, yes, but the answers have changed. And that type of thing is important in organizations as well. The answers often change. So as we think about creative paradoxes, these are things to get background in our mind in reference to the dynamic nature of creativity in organizations. The secondary piece I want to layer on top of the paradoxes is going to be the idea journey phase. And so when we think about creativity in an organization, it's not just that one idea and that's it. There's a process that goes through to where that idea is actually executed in a way that drives strategic value for the organization. And so this process, you can see referenced below, starts with what we think of traditionally as creativity, which is the idea generation process, which we are either in groups or individually asking that in what ways can we question? What problem needs to be solved? To use Clayton Christensen's language from The Innovator's Dilemma, what's the job to be done? So we're asking these questions and generating these ideas to solve these problems for ourselves or for our clients. It's in this moment where you find that diversity of input becomes important. If you study design thinking based off of the IDEO organization, so design thinking says you have to start with a wide scope of ideas to get to better ideas, right? And so if you start with one idea, it's often you're going to ramhole that one through, and it won't be as creative as if you start with a plentiful of ideas. When we do creativity workshops for organizations, we often will challenge people on a question to come up with 7 ideas just to solve one problem. And they're amazed at how it's easy because you start with those first 2 or 3 ideas are quick to go on the paper, and then it starts to slow down. And as we work through this as a group, we had discovered that often when we're trying to generate an idea, the first 2 to 3 ideas we generate are history-based. In other words, ideas that we had before. It's only when we start pushing ourselves for a greater number of ideas, up to 7, there's nothing magical about 7, just as you push yourself towards 7, that's when you start to unlock creativity within the mind. And this is a group process that's very helpful because that idea elaboration is going to be next. we might have a great idea. My daughter and I were watching Shark Tank. And if you've watched Shark Tank, there are some really clever ideas and there are some interesting ideas on Shark Tank. And we were watching one recently where a gentleman had decided to solve the peanut butter problem that we all have, which is how to get the peanut butter off the side of your peanut butter jar. And so he had created a peanut butter pump in order to get a full maximum amount of peanut butter out of your peanut butter. Okay, you're with me that this does not make any sense at all. Like, this is not a problem. It might be said this way: it's a you problem, not a me problem, right? It's something that he was dealing with, and he was finding a $30 solution to getting all the peanut butter out of your peanut butter jar. Only works with creamy. That would be a moment where a diversity of ideas would probably be best, right? He didn't go very far on Shark Tank that particular day, because that idea generation in isolation, oh, this is fantastic. But then when you get to the idea elaboration, that's where the socialization process becomes even more critical, including ideas like psychological safety. Strong ties and weak ties become important with inclusivity. Because if you have somebody who has a different perspective, we need to hear their voice. How do we minimize the loudest voice in the room in a way that all the voices become heard in that process? And then you get to, once we have elaborated on that idea and we get to a better idea, which, by the way, now becomes more of a conflict versus cooperation, because now you want to get that idea to a point to where it can be championed in the organization. It's something that can fly, something that can work. When we worked with organizations, we just wrapped up a project with a major manufacturer, and we call those champion projects. And as they were presenting those champion projects, part of the process is how do you then sell that internally to the organization? Because it's, unfortunately, the old phrase of build a better mousetrap and the world will lead a path to your door doesn't happen anymore. The world's not paying attention. The world is busy. So you have to, even inside organizations, so you have to have that skills to champion those projects. So then it can really come into execution. And that's where, as leaders, it becomes really critical for us. Inclusivity becomes important. Being able to work with social capital becomes important. People that we have an intentional desire to hear every voice in the room. Because the loudest voice in the room is it's not their issue, it's our issue. Meaning, as leaders, we're the ones that have to create spaces and design and mitigate that. So as you look at those different ideas, I want to kind of take those and then reference that back to Pixar. It's an organization that we referenced earlier. And so when you take a look at what Pixar is about, there's a couple of things that they utilize to help this idea generation, elaboration, championing, and then execution process. First of all, we must stay close to innovation happening elsewhere. In other words, keep our eyes up versus eyes down. It's really hard in the middle of what the 4 disciplines of execution calls the whirlwind. In the middle of the whirlwind, it's hard to not keep your eyes down. In the midst of the pandemic, it's hard not to keep your eyes down because you have to make things happen. That being said, we have to also have eyes up to see what else is going on. The psychological safety piece, which we're going to dive in more to, it must be safe for everyone to offer ideas, and everyone must have freedom to communicate with anyone. The Pixar headquarters was designed specifically by Steve Jobs to ensure that people ran into each other. Isn't that quaint post-pandemic, to think about it, where we actually want people to interact, with each other closely? Google famously put their tables too close together in the lunchroom so people would literally bump into each other. Perhaps those concepts will come back. The idea is how do we have freedom to communicate with anyone in the organization? My daughter and I were, last night, watching Hidden Figures, the story of the African-American women who were so important to the U.S. space program in the 1970s, the Gemini process. And the idea of everyone having the freedom to communicate with anyone comes up several times within that movie about how those best ideas, directly or indirectly, were being suppressed in the organization. And even if you're familiar with the movie, the director of that particular lab, NASA, was specifically asking for everyone to come up with ideas. So the leader's doing what you would expect the leader to do, and yet still, systemically, those ideas kept getting repressed. And so it's really important in organizations to create that dynamic to where it's not just what we say, but it's what we do and it's who we are. The culture, those mindsets and the behaviors become critical. And so when we think about those operating principles at Pixar, I'm going to ask again. As you think about your organization, and as we specifically think about those 4 layers, where do you feel like the friction happens in your organization? So just to go back to this idea journey phase, where is the friction in your organization? Where do you get to and then get stuck? Where do you find yourself wanting more effort by the organization? We're going to look at drivers for each one of these, but I'm curious before we start, where might it get sticky?
I'll give you an example, Allyn. In our organization, I think Dean Irvin said it well when he said, it's individuals working because they chose to work in an individual way. So I think the execution is where I see some stickiness because we might have an idea, elaborate the idea, champion the idea, but when it comes to the execution, that's where you need all the parts of a greater thing to collaborate together. And, maybe we didn't include enough people early on in that process. That could possibly be it.
Okay, I was going to ask, yeah.
Yeah, so, but I see it cyclical in some things, in that whole idea of, well, we've never done this before. So.
John Cotter, when he wrote a lot about the change process in organizations, he talked about the importance of a guiding coalition, having a larger group that's driving the change versus an individual. Because unfortunately, we tend to be armies that we shoot the person who's in front, even if they're in our army, right? Or get a little further out on that limb, I've got a saw ready for you. And so that's back to that. You go fast if you go alone, but you tend to outpace. We go further when we go together. So how do we create that social process to where that becomes our idea versus my idea or your idea? I think we treat it differently in organizations when it becomes something we're doing versus something that you're doing. Yeah. So thank you. I think that's a great insight. Thank you. Yes.
As I started up at the top of that list and think as Carolyn was saying with some of the execution and just keep coming back, I think in our organization it gets down to the elaboration. I think somebody will come up with a good idea as he or she's trying to show everybody else, explain why that's such a good idea. They fail on that, and others are less willing to take up that mantle and accept that new idea because they're comfortable in their own way of doing things. They don't like the change. They don't, and they haven't had it explained to them or demonstrated to them sufficiently to where they could see the benefit of whatever this new idea, this creative, innovative way of accomplishing something is there.
I think you're describing in a very fair way that paradox itself. On one end, you have a comfort zone. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest in the organization, so I'm not going to be as likely to drive forward on somebody else's idea. And on the other end of it, did I explain it in a way to where it caught? Right? I communicated it in a way that we understood the problem we were solving and what the benefit was to the organization. It wasn't the peanut butter pump. It was something really useful. I hope the chat isn't blowing up about, okay, nobody's upset. Okay, it could have been somebody's idea. I don't know. But on one hand, we're communicating the peanut butter pump and everybody's like, And on the other hand, we have comfort zones that cause us not to. And then the third dynamic that I think is reality for most organizations today is change fatigue. The cumulative nature of change over the last 2 years has been remarkable. It's built up in the system, and you might even seen it to where easy things become hard because there's just been so much going on. And so those great ideas at this time could be pushed aside, not because they're not great ideas, but because I'm tired, particularly within the healthcare space, particularly within the manufacturing space, particularly within those organizations that have been through the gauntlet. Sometimes you just want to take a breather as well. Yes?
You may talk about this later on, but to what extent is the organizational culture a mitigating factor in these steps, in dealing with the paradoxes, in dealing with the journey?
Yeah.
It seems to me that the culture of the organization may contribute or mitigate these influences.
What Peter Drucker famously said, that culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch or some sort of meal, right? And that culture is going to eat creativity for lunch, or serve. Probably not the best analogy, but you get the idea, right? It's that if culture are the embedded mindsets and behaviors of an organization, regardless of what the mission statement says, the culture is those embedded mindsets and behaviors of the organization, the values that drive us, the things we value. That will, as leaders, is something to explore and to consider, because that will cause this to flourish or to die. And so as leaders, we have to be very mindful of the culture that we're dealing with and how to mitigate that as we think about creativity. Yes, Darby?
Judy says, from my experience, it came down to show me how this is going to affect the organization, as in the bottom line, show the data.
Okay. And so culturally within that organization, it's KPI, it's data-driven. You have to sell that idea in a way that it's going to generate value back to the organization. When we looked through our study, what we took a look at is we were trying to identify highly creative organizations. So the organizations that had that culture, the organizations that had that dynamics that drove it. And so we were looking for these combinations of these answers, that people in my organization have good ideas, we change and improve things pretty quickly, so we're agile as an organization, we have a reputation for being innovative. And what we determined of the organizations that we surveyed and studied, about 20% came out as what we call highly creative organizations. And then identifying those highly creative organizations, then we drilled even further in the data to understand in those organizations, what were the things that were driving those behaviors? What were the things that were causing that highly creative organization to work with? So this is a summary slide of the model. And we're going to be walking through quickly 10 different drivers for highly creative organizations in their space and their world. We're going to subdivide it into 3 areas. We're going to take a look at the individual, take a look at the team, and then take a look organizationally what those drivers may be. So how are they different? Let's start with how the individuals are worked with in the organization. So the very first thing that we noted when we looked at highly creative organizations was that they protect the intrinsic motivation of their employees. So just quick definitions: intrinsic motivation is the motivation from within versus extrinsic motivation, which is incentives and compulsory and mandated and compliance and things. So if I'm giving you a bonus, it's extrinsic. If it's coming from your desire around purpose, it's intrinsic. A really good book on the subject is Daniel Pink's book called Drive. And so when they looked at the individuals inside those organizations, we took a look at how the individuals feel. First of all, they felt valued by the organization, which is one of the primary drivers of employee engagement. They felt confident. So it tracks that in organizations that are highly creative, people are confident. They're more likely to offer those ideas. And then more importantly, they feel empowered. In other words, it's going to make a difference. They have a sense that ideas matter and the organization is interested in those particular ideas. Most of those variables are on any employee engagement survey that you might do, particularly if it's looking at the emotions around engagement. So we can look at our own data and see, what is creativity like in my organization? Well, I need to think about, what are my people feeling in the organization? The second element that was important from an individual perspective was they help people gain knowledge and expertise. Steve Jobs famously said that creativity is just connecting things. The point about that is you have to have things to connect. You have to have ideas that matter, ideas that you work with wonders. So they have to have those expertise, that knowledge, learn new skills. I was just listening to a book by Dr. Keith Farron it's called Transcend. It's an update on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he was talking about dopamine levels around learning. And he said for many people, they think when you think of getting a dopamine hit, you're thinking about doing an adventure, a success, something physically we do, a runner's high. he was saying that you can actually track dopamine levels rise when we learn stuff. And I think we feel that too. Like when you get a concept, an idea, we call it an epiphany. It's actually dopamine that's being released in our system. So this idea of learning is something that is going to generate more ideas for an organization, which means that creativity is connecting things, which means we have to have a learning environment in the organization. They encourage people to build networks. This is a stat I thought was interesting. Weak ties tend to promote creativity, but 3 in 10 people who began working remotely due to COVID-19 are aware they speak with fewer coworkers now than they did when they were in the office. We don't bump into each other anymore. We have strong ties that we still connect with because we're on a text stream, chat stream, whatever the current technology stream is with those individuals. But weak ties are individuals we don't connect with, and that's where creativity can come with. Microsoft did a deep dive study with their Outlook platform, and basically they confirmed this, that we're interacting less with people, and less with people with weak ties and more with people with strong ties. And again, weak ties is what that generates ideas because people see things from various perspective and information. So whatever we can do to create opportunities for people to connect with people they don't normally connect with, virtually or in person, become really critical. The final piece is, for the individual, is flowers need space to grow. And the same is true of people and ideas. Stress is the creativity killer. About 45% of people are less likely to think creatively on high pressure versus low pressure work days. It was a 2002 study that basically showed and proved that when we're under high stress, we're less creative. Why? Head down. We're just getting it done. We don't want to stretch the comfort zone. We just want to have some things that feel a little more normal. So sometimes people will say, well, when I'm under pressure, that's when I come up with my best ideas. And so, yes, invention, like they say that, necessity is the mother of invention. Perhaps, but stress is the killer of it. And so I think there's a difference there, a subtle difference in terms of the pressure that we're under. Stress activates the freeze or flight or fight syndrome. It activates aspects of our brain that keeps us laser focused more on the now versus the future. And so we have less creative ideas, which means as organizations, we need space. What was it? Google famously gave people a quarter or a fifth of their time to just come up with ideas. There's some good psychological boundaries or reasons for that. So in our organizations, we have to think, how do I create space for people to think? Blue sky thinking. Just get out and ponder what could happen. So as a group discussion, what are the state of those drivers in your organization today? When you think about intrinsic motivation, learning new things, building networks, well-being of people, what do you find that you're flourishing in? Because I think it would be helpful to get some ideas. In addition to that, what's an area that perhaps you struggle with? Others may have some ideas as well. So we're going to give that opportunity in the chat and or in the room for concepts around where do you feel like your organization is doing well, and or what are some things you find that you struggle with? Yes, Darby.
Jim says, how do we encourage individuals to want to learn, raise the dopamine level?
Thank you, Jim, for asking it in that way. It goes down to intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, and really understanding from that person's perspective where they want to grow and learn. We were just working a leadership project with an accountancy firm, and part of the project we were working with how they were doing their one-on-ones and thinking about questions that we're asking that generate that possibility thinking and that interest for the individuals. I think most people, if you just dump a bunch of asynchronous learning in the organization, most studies find that about less than 10%, sometimes less than 6%, actually use that and complete it because it's just there. It's that horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So really understanding from that employee their intrinsic motivators, where they're headed, and then how do we funnel learning into that space.
So many organizations are dealing with the stress that you talked about of just keeping the bills paid, keeping the lights on, getting the product out the back door. You briefly touched on the time concept. What are you seeing that organizations are doing to allow for that time that is necessary for ideas to blossom?
One of the major areas that we can impact it directly is permission, i.e. people feel like they have to stay on it, focused, in their workspace, and permission to get up, move around, find space for it. It doesn't actually take much. Most studies will show that 15 to 20 minutes of break from emails, from connection, just something different will allow that brain to relax. I think the other thing we can do is to encourage those ideas and recognize it when those ideas come out in the organization. So permission to take the time, and then encouragement when the ideas come become really critical for organizations.
Well, this is really like a light bulb moment for me, because earlier I was thinking about my department, a bunch of intrinsically motivated people who are going out there, to benefit the university in terms of fundraising. But during the pandemic, our calendars cleared, because if we're sitting at our desks, we're not really doing our jobs. And so what was really interesting about that time is our department manager set up 2 weekly Zoom meetings.
Okay.
And what I found there, because we're all in our different colleges, different spaces, that was such a friendly, calmly paced way that we could be creative and talk about ideas and share ideas with each other. And I could even see, when an idea was born, if it was somebody else's idea, and then got to see it carried through, which makes us feel part of the process.
Yeah.
What I found, now that we're all back in our offices, is even though we do have regular meetings in person, we're all still driven to, I've got the next appointment. So we're not having those lengthy discussions. We are like, well, if I'm sitting here, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be. So I wonder how we can talk about that to recapture that organizational pace that allowed for creativity.
Yeah. What do you think? It's again, back to permission and scheduling the time, that is important, right? This is doing the job. Is to think about how we're doing the job better. Back to, I think it was Michael Gerber in the E-Myth talked about how people work in the business, not on the business. And scheduling time to work on the business becomes critical. There was a study by Charles Hummel done in the 1960s called The Tyranny of the Urgent. And that's where that grid for time management often is utilized, time utilization around things that are urgent or things that are important. Charles Hummel came up with that original idea. And as Dwight D. Eisenhower said, the urgent overwhelms the important. And so whatever we classify as urgent will take precedent over the things we find as important. So reclassification of the importance of, because as Charles Hummel said way back in the 1960s, whatever we discard that's important will become urgent, right, at some point in the organization. And so when we think about, that's at the individual level. So let's think about it as a team level. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to make a comment. I think some of the issues in the workplace now has to do with individuals thinking more about intrinsic motivation. And so we hear that younger people look for other reasons to work. Some people in our generation, you went to work because you get a paycheck. But now people talk about purpose.
Yeah.
And when there's purpose, then there is more of intrinsic motivation.
Yeah. Nobody in the chat is going to believe that you weren't a plant, because the very next slide is about tasks and purpose in the organization. I mean, it's literally the next slide. We are on the same page, Dr. Sequoia. We are on the same page. Yes, because from a team perspective, the connections between tasks and purpose become critical when we think about creativity. It said just 1 in 3 respondents in the survey by McKinsey believe their organizations strongly connect actions to purpose in the organization. And so it's all the way back to Jack Welch, who said you have to communicate your vision until you're sick of hearing it, and then you've just begun. And many of us, we might intuitively say, this is the purpose of our organization. It's obvious because as leaders we talk about it, but is that known and seen, and particularly how the tasks that we're doing? Famously, when Lyndon Johnson was walking through NASA in the 1960s, he came across a janitor who he asked, what is your job here? And the janitor replied, my job is to put a man on the moon. That's task and purpose, connection. So how do we continue to think about that purpose of the organization? Because what purpose does is it engenders empathy. Because when I have a purpose, it's usually beyond myself, which means I'm thinking of others, which is now activating part of my creative juices as to how do I help the other person versus just help myself. I remember when Peter Laviolette first came to the Nashville Predators years ago, and I had an opportunity to talk with him at a Civic Club meeting. And I asked him what motivates players. And it was interesting, his response, because he was famous for his ability to motivate hockey players. And he said, hockey players are motivated by the guy sitting next to him, not themselves. And it really struck me. It's the next he's going over the wall. He's going onto the ice, not for himself, but for the other guy. And I thought that was a really interesting response. And how do we as organizations really connect our purpose to where we're going over the wall, not for our own reasons, we'll have our reasons, but tie it to the purpose of the organization that I connect with as well. Will it be 100% in a large organization? No. Can I get it a higher percentage? Yeah, I believe so. I believe so. The other aspect, and we're now getting to Judy's question almost half an hour ago, around psychological safety. In reference to we create and we maintain psychological safety, we did an entire workshop on this back in November as part of this series, and so I would encourage you to reflect back on that or find that. In addition to that, what we find in terms of these teams in highly creative organizations, you can see the disparity between they're willing to bring up tough issues and problems to leaders. Leaders make it safe for them to experiment and learn from mistakes. My team is comfortable with constructive controversy, disagreement about ideas. And to me, the important part of this psychological safety, it's building it beyond I just feel like I belong. So often when we think about psychological safety, we'll leave it at the I belong level. But what we found is that psychological safety is not just that I belong, but it's that I can challenge, I can learn, I can disagree in the organization. That's psychological safety. Back to Patrick Leonisi's 5 dysfunctions of a team, trust is built when we have that level of psychological safety. So in creative organizations, we do engender the psychological safety of not just you're welcome, but I want to hear what you have to say. And I'm willing to let you fail. And I'm even happier when you disagree because that means it's going to be better. And as leaders, it all flows downhill. The final element on the team side is that teams learn and use creative techniques. And so in highly creative organizations, it's not just enough to say, we want this, but it's specifically finding ways to do this, to get a structure in place. We just finished up a creative skullworks with one of our clients, and one of the elements that we found is they were able to generate several $1 million of return back to the organization. None of those ideas was Dale Carnegie's ideas. They were all ideas that were inherent in the people that came into that room. They just needed time, space, and a process to make it happen. And again, so if we believe that we have creative individuals in the organization, as organizations, we find those techniques, that time and that space to make those ideas flow, and strong teams do just that. So when we think about the team elements, we're going to take just a moment to think about what is the most important element for you. So in the chat, if you've been active in the chat, thank you. If you haven't so far, go ahead and just answer this almost like a survey. Number 1, number 2, number 3. What would you say is the most critical one in your organization to enhance? Task to purpose, psychological safety, or finding ways to utilize creative techniques? So we'll get a sense of what that looks like. Darby's got her pen out. She's doing it. In addition to that, in the room comments as well in terms of what might be important. Since we have just a few minutes remaining, I'm going to go ahead and get to the organizational side as well. So the final element of the model, go ahead and keep those up, and I'll be curious to circle back around to it, Darby. So in the final element of creativity is social, the model focused first on the individual, and then we took a look at the team, And finally, let's take just a few moments and take a peek at organizationally what we can do. The first one is no surprise because it's similar to what we did before, which is organizational purpose is clear and compelling. Highly creative organizations, the people were rock solid in terms of purpose. The second one was they appreciate and encourage initiative. This is a sad study for me, that only 1 in 4 or fewer strongly agreed with the following, that the company's basically open to ideas. So we might say what we want to say, but are we truly open to those ideas? Which is interesting because when you look at the 2025 jobs report that was put out in terms of needed jobs in the workplace for 2025, a top 5 needed skill is creativity. And as organizations, are we then allowing that to flourish becomes the question. That was a feature of Job Survey 2020 by the World Economic Forum. The final element that I do want to get to is simply this, that we cultivate and sustain what we're going to call deep level diversity. You can see the stats that are up on the slide in terms of what diversity means in those organizations. I would say what we're finding, and I think most organizations are, where diversity is not enough, inclusion becomes the lever. Right? So diversity is inert in terms of a force in an organization if inclusion isn't also there to activate it. So you have teams that are diverse. My team is diverse in terms of training and backgrounds. We see the values. Those are all important. Sustained diversity is where we have this inclusive environment where, again, all voices are heard. So diversity is great. Inclusion is even better. It's that old saying of being invited to the party, but are we asked to dance? And so as leaders, it becomes really critical for us to think of who's not dancing in the organization. Who might be doing who might be dancing in the center of the room that doesn't need to be dancing quite so much, right? That loud person. That might be me in some cases. But who's the person that's against the wall that we need to activate, we need to work for, and specifically think that they might have weak ties in the organization, but they have great ideas. And so we're going to allow a few moments at the end for comments and questions, anything that we wanted to finish up with. I will say that there are a couple of resources that I want to make sure that you see. First of all, we did produce a white paper on this particular subject. You can go down to our website and download the white paper. It is free to do that. In addition to that, we also have a creativity assessment that can be done for our organizations that I'm happy to help with, and my email's up on the screen as well. We talked about it from an individual to a team to an organizational level. We started with kindergartners and how creative we are, and that systems and structures drive that out of us. And so as leaders, it now becomes our responsibility to create those environments at all 3 levels that builds that back up again, that embodies that to come out in each individual. And the success comes from those results and those benefits that we see. So I believe I have, Darby's got the clock. How much time do I have I have 3 minutes for questions, comments, answers, queries, or concerns. Who would have the first question? Yes.
I was interested in your comments on diversity, and I think what I get out of it, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that enlightened organizations, creative organizations go beyond creativity being indicated by just counting how many are in a particular category, how many are have a particular skill. And when we get to the issue of inclusion, that implies to me that we have to have a way for people who are different to be comfortable interacting with each other. Because inclusion is one thing, inclusion and acceptance and embracing differences is another.
100%. Yeah, that's the lever in the organizations, is that true inclusivity, that true inclusion that leverages the advantages of diversity in the organization, and be very mindful of that for sure. Mm-hmm.
When most people hear diversity, they think of the gender breakdown or the ethnic breakdown. Mm-hmm. Talk about the diversity of thought and ideas. Different mindsets of people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That they may be homogenous from the standpoint of all of the same race, ethnic background, but just the diversity of thought.
I have. I'm a classic Gen X, so if you want to talk Star Wars references, I'm ready to go. And that's not diverse either if everyone's a Gen X leader in my organization. Personalities, socioeconomic backgrounds is another layer of diversity that's been studied quite a bit. What type of degrees that we come from, what type of educational experiences that we've had, being able to see populations that we serve in different ways because I'm connected to those populations in different ways. And so I believe that you're right in that with diversity, there are some categories that are important to consider, and there are aspects of it that we need to go even further and even deeper because we believe as leaders it's important to hear, and the reality is it's not just to hear, but to have insight into. Because if I come from a poor background, let's say a rural up on the plateau or Appalachia within the Tennessee space, and I come from a socioeconomic background, I'm going to view healthcare differently than if I grew up in Williamson County or even Rutherford County. And that's important to understand too from an organizational perspective. So I think that deep level diversity is encompassing a wide variety of space that we have and acknowledging what that does for the organization when we have that. Well, creativity is social, meaning I believe that we all have that creative spark within us. We were all designed that way to be creative. And in groups, we're even more creative moving forward. So as leaders, take a look at that team, the individual, the team, and the organizational layers that we create that dynamic environment to truly have diversity work in our organizations. Creativity work in our organizations. I was still thinking about the question. Dr. Urban.
Let's give Allyn some intrinsic reward for his presentation. Thank you very much, Allyn, for that informative and thought-provoking presentation. Please mark your calendars for our next event, which is on April 29th, 2022. Also, for more information about Jones College programs, including a lot of programs very creatively delivered in convenient virtual formats, go to mtsu.edu/business. Have a great day.